What happens when a late-night talk show host decides he can humiliate one of Hollywood's most accomplished action stars on live television? What unfolds when someone who has never thrown a real punch in his life tries to belittle someone who has fought his way up from the streets of Boston to the pinnacle of entertainment? The answer became painfully, brutally, unforgettably clear in what would become the most explosive confrontation in late-night television history. This is the story of how 34 seconds of pure arrogance destroyed Jimmy Kimmel's carefully cultivated image and revealed to millions of viewers the ugly truth hiding behind that smug smile. This is the story of how Mark Wahlberg, a man who had clawed his way from rock bottom to the top of Hollywood, refused to be anyone's punchline. And this is the story of what happens when someone who has faced real danger, real struggle, real consequences, meets someone who has only ever faced an audience that laughs on cue. What you're about to witness isn't just another celebrity spat. It isn't just another awkward interview moment that gets forgotten by the next news cycle. This is a masterclass in dignity, in standing your ground, in showing the world that some people cannot be diminished no matter how bright the studio lights or how loud the laughter. Mark Wahlberg walked into that studio expecting a professional interview. What he got was an ambush. What Jimmy Kimmel got was a lesson he would never forget. The lights blazed hot in the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio that evening, casting their familiar glow across the polished floor and the iconic desk where countless celebrities had sat before. The audience buzzed with anticipation, phones tucked away, ready to witness another entertaining conversation between two Hollywood heavyweights. Mark Wahlberg emerged from backstage with the confident stride of a man who had earned his place in the industry through decades of relentless work. He looked good. He always looked good. The product of those legendary 4 a.m. workouts, the discipline that had transformed him from a troubled kid into one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood. His handshake with Kimmel was firm, professional, the greeting of two men who had done this dance many times before. The audience applauded warmly as Mark settled into the guest chair, crossing one leg over the other with casual ease. The initial moments of the interview flowed smoothly enough. Mark was there to promote his latest action film, a project that had consumed months of his life with grueling training sessions and demanding stunt work. He spoke about the production with genuine enthusiasm, his Boston accent adding authenticity to every word. The crew had worked incredibly hard. The director had pushed everyone to their limits. The final product was something they were all proud of. Jimmy nodded along, that familiar half-smile playing across his features. He asked the expected questions about the training regimen, about working with the cast, about the challenges of the shoot. Everything appeared normal. Everything seemed routine. But those who knew Jimmy Kimmel, those who had studied his interviewing style over the years, recognized something different in his demeanor that night. There was a quality to his questions that felt like setup, a certain gleam in his eye that suggested he was waiting for something. His posture was slightly more forward than usual, like a predator preparing to pounce. The friendly banter was merely the calm before a storm that Mark Wahlberg had no reason to expect. Little did anyone in that studio know that the pleasant conversation unfolding before them was about to transform into something unprecedented. The warmth in the room was artificial, the camaraderie a facade. Behind Jimmy's practiced smile lurked an ambush that would backfire in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The shift happened so quickly that later, when people re-watched the footage, they would struggle to identify the exact moment the atmosphere changed. 1 second Jimmy was nodding along to Mark's description of a particularly challenging stunt sequence. The next second, his expression transformed into something sharper, more predatory. "So Mark, welcome back to the show," Jimmy said, and there was something in his tone that made the audience sit up slightly straighter. That fake smile was plastered across his face like he was doing Mark some kind of favor just by having him there. "I got to ask, how does it feel being Hollywood's most overpaid tough guy?" The audience went silent. Not the comfortable silence of anticipation, but the shocked silence of people who have just witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. You could hear the air conditioning humming. You could hear the subtle whir of the cameras. You could hear absolutely nothing from the crowd. Mark's jaw tightened. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the cameras caught it. His eyes, which had been warm and open moments before, narrowed slightly. But he was a professional. He had been doing this for decades. He knew how to handle difficult interviewers. "Jimmy, I'm here to talk about the movie," Mark said, his voice steady and controlled. The crew worked really hard on this project. But Jimmy Kimmel wasn't interested in the movie. He wasn't interested in the crew or their hard work or the story they had spent months bringing to life. He leaned back in his chair with the self-satisfied air of someone who believes they're untouchable, who thinks their platform gives them the right to say whatever they want without consequence. "Oh, come on, Mark," Jimmy continued, his voice dripping with false camaraderie. "Everyone knows you just show up, flex a little, say a few lines, and walk away with $20 million. Must be nice living that easy life." The temperature in that studio shot up 10 degrees. You could feel the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. The audience members exchanged uncomfortable glances. The crew members behind the cameras shifted uneasily. Everyone could sense that something had fundamentally changed. Mark's eyes narrowed further. This wasn't playful banter anymore. This wasn't the good-natured ribbing that talk show hosts and their guests sometimes engaged in. This was a direct attack on everything Mark Wahlberg had worked for, everything he had achieved, everything he had sacrificed. Easy life? Mark's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made everyone in the studio lean forward. You want to talk about easy? Try getting up at 4 in the morning every day. Try training for months until your body screams for mercy. Try doing your own stunts while some people sit behind a desk making jokes about other people's work. The words landed like hammer blows. Jimmy's expression flickered, the first crack appearing in his smug facade. He hadn't expected this. He had expected Mark to laugh it off, to play along, to accept the insult with the good humor that guests were supposed to display. Instead, he was facing someone who refused to be diminished. Whoa, somebody's getting a little defensive, Jimmy said, trying desperately to regain control of the conversation. His voice had taken on a slightly higher pitch, the sound of someone realizing they may have miscalculated badly. I'm just saying some of us had to work our way up the hard way. Not everyone gets handed movie roles because they have nice muscles. That was it. That was the moment Jimmy Kimmel crossed a line he should never have crossed. The audience held its collective breath. The camera operators kept their equipment steady through sheer professional instinct, even as they personally recoiled from what was unfolding. Mark sat forward in his chair, and you could see the fire building in his eyes. Not the theatrical anger of a movie scene, but something real, something forged in the streets of Boston and tempered by years of fighting for every opportunity. Handed to me? Mark's voice was incredulous, dangerous. Are you serious right now? Do you know what I was doing when I was 15 years old? I was on the streets trying to survive while you were probably in some fancy college somewhere learning how to make fun of people for a living. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Jimmy Kimmel sat frozen in his chair, his carefully constructed persona crumbling in real time before millions of viewers. Hey, I'm just trying to have some fun here, Jimmy attempted, his voice cracking slightly. It's all jokes, Mark. Relax. Relax? The word exploded from Mark with controlled fury. You invite me on your show and then you sit there and disrespect everything I've worked for? You think because you have a microphone and a studio audience that gives you the right to tear people down? The confrontation had reached a point of no return. There would be no walking this back, no pretending it was all in good fun, no editing it out in post-production. This was happening live, in front of millions of people, and Jimmy Kimmel had no one to blame but himself. Mark's voice grew louder, but he wasn't yelling. He was speaking with the kind of controlled intensity that makes people really listen, the voice of someone who has learned to channel their anger into something powerful rather than destructive. I've been acting for over 20 years, Mark continued, each word a precisely aimed strike. I've produced movies. I've built businesses. I've tried to give back to my community. And you want to sit there and tell me I don't deserve what I've earned? Jimmy was squirming now. His whole smug attitude was crumbling right there on live television. The man who made his living making others uncomfortable was finally experiencing what it felt like to be on the receiving end. Look, I didn't mean Jimmy started. No, you meant exactly what you said. Mark cut him off with surgical precision. You thought you could bring me on here and make me look like some dumb musclehead for your audience to laugh at. But here's the thing, Jimmy. Mark paused, letting the silence stretch out, letting the tension build to an almost unbearable level. I didn't come from Hollywood royalty. I didn't have connections or rich parents. Everything I have, I fought for. The words hung in the air like a verdict. The audience sat in stunned silence, some nodding along with Mark, others looking shocked that someone was actually standing up to their precious host. The power dynamic in the room had completely inverted. The host had become the defendant, and he was losing badly. Jimmy tried to regain control. Okay, let's just move on to the movie. Tell us about... No. Mark's voice was firm, absolute, leaving no room for negotiation. We're not moving on. You started this conversation, so let's finish it. The host's face went pale. He had lost control of his own show, and there was nothing he could do about it. You want to talk about the hard way? Mark leaned forward, his presence dominating the space between them. I was arrested multiple times as a kid. I made mistakes, real mistakes that hurt people, and I've spent my entire adult life trying to make up for that. While you were making jokes about celebrities, I was learning how to be a better person. The passion in Mark's voice was undeniable. This wasn't some rehearsed Hollywood speech written by publicists and practiced in front of mirrors. This was real emotion coming from a real place, forged in the fires of genuine struggle and redemption. I work 16-hour days when I'm on set, Mark continued, his voice gaining strength with each revelation. I study scripts until 2 in the morning. I train with real fighters and real cops to make sure I'm giving audiences something authentic. And you want to call that easy? Jimmy Kimmel was completely out of his depth. His writers hadn't prepared him for this. His usual sarcastic comebacks weren't working. Every weapon in his arsenal had been neutralized by the simple, devastating power of truth. Mark, I think you're taking this a little too seriously, Jimmy attempted weakly. Too seriously? Mark's eyebrows rose in disbelief. My work is my life. The people I work with, the stories we tell, the audiences who pay their hard-earned money to see these movies that's serious to me. What's not serious is sitting behind a desk making cheap shots at people who are actually out there creating something. The camera kept rolling, capturing every word, every expression, every moment of Jimmy's accelerating downfall. This was becoming something unprecedented in late-night television history. You know what the difference is between you and me, Jimmy? Mark's voice was steady, powerful, carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak through years of sacrifice and growth. When I mess up, when I fail, when I don't deliver what people expect, there are real consequences. Movies lose money, people lose jobs, fans lose faith. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the studio like a heavy fog. But you? You can say whatever you want, tear down whoever you want, and tomorrow night you'll be right back here doing the same thing to someone else. Jimmy looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. His hands were shaking as he reached for his coffee mug, desperate for something to do, some way to break the intensity of Mark's gaze. You want to know what's really easy, Jimmy? Mark's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. What's easy is hiding behind comedy. What's easy is pretending that tearing people down is just entertainment. The host set his coffee mug down with trembling hands. He was trying to maintain that late-night host composure, but cracks were showing everywhere. The mask was slipping, and underneath was something far less impressive than the confident persona he projected every night. Mark, I think we should probably take a commercial break, Jimmy said desperately. No breaks. Mark leaned forward, his presence commanding the entire studio. You wanted to have this conversation on live television, so let's have it. You think I don't know what you really think about actors like me? You think we're all just pretty faces with no substance? The audience was completely captivated. Some people had their phones out, recording every second of this historic confrontation, knowing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. I've been in this business long enough to know the difference between someone who respects the craft and someone who just sees us as punchlines, Mark continued. And right now, you're showing everyone exactly which one you are. Jimmy tried to laugh, but it came out as a nervous wheeze. Come on, Mark. You're being way too sensitive here. It's just comedy. People expect me to roast the guests a little. Roast? Mark's expression shifted to one of genuine disgust. Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're just being mean for the sake of being mean. There's a difference between comedy and cruelty, Jimmy. The host was visibly sweating now under those hot studio lights. His usual confidence was completely gone, replaced by the desperate energy of a man watching his carefully constructed image collapse in real time. Look, if I offended you, I apologize, Jimmy managed. That wasn't my intention. Your intention? Mark shook his head slowly, deliberately. Your intention was to make me look stupid so your audience would laugh. Your intention was to boost your own ego by putting down someone who's actually accomplished something. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. The producers could be seen off camera, frantically gesturing, trying to figure out how to handle this situation. But there was nothing they could do. This was live television, and Mark Wahlberg wasn't done yet. You know what bothers me most about this? Mark asked, his voice carrying a new edge of disappointment. It's not even about me. It's about all the young actors, the ones just starting out, who have to sit in chairs like this and let people like you mock their dreams just to get their projects promoted. The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. This wasn't just about Mark's wounded pride. This was about something larger, something that spoke to the fundamental cruelty that had become normalized in entertainment media. I've been fortunate enough to make it in this business, so I can sit here and defend myself, Mark continued. But what about the kid from Boston, or Chicago, or wherever, who works 3 jobs just to afford acting classes? What happens when they sit across from you, and you decide their story isn't worth respecting? Jimmy Kimmel had no answer. He sat there, diminished, exposed, unable to mount any kind of defense against the truth being laid bare before millions of viewers. You know what the saddest part is? Mark said, his voice softening slightly but losing none of its power. You actually have talent. You're funny when you're not being cruel. You could use this platform to lift people up, to celebrate their achievements, to make people feel good about themselves. Instead, you choose to punch down. For a moment, something flickered in Jimmy's eyes. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe it was shame. But whatever moment of self-awareness might have been forming was quickly overwhelmed by desperation. You think you're so much better than me? Jimmy snapped, his mask finally slipping completely. You think because you've made some action movies that makes you some kind of saint. Everyone knows about your past, Mark. Everyone knows you were a thug before you were an actor. The studio went dead quiet. Even the cameras seemed to stop moving. The air itself seemed to freeze as the weight of what Jimmy had just said settled over everyone present. Mark's expression didn't change, but something cold and dangerous flashed in his eyes. Something that reminded everyone in that room that this was a man who had survived things Jimmy Kimmel couldn't even imagine. There it is, Mark said softly, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying to every corner of that silent studio. There's the real Jimmy Kimmel. When you can't win with comedy, you go straight for the personal attacks. Jimmy realized immediately that he had made a terrible mistake. The words were out there now, broadcast live to millions of people, impossible to take back. Mark, I didn't mean. Yes, you did. Mark's voice was like ice. You absolutely meant it. You've been waiting for the perfect moment to bring up my past, haven't you? You thought if you could make me angry enough, I'd give you the reaction you wanted. The host was completely panicking now. His career, his reputation, his carefully cultivated image, all of it was imploding in real time. That's not true, Jimmy protested weakly. I would never. You just did, Jimmy. On live television. In front of all these people. Mark stood up slowly, deliberately. The entire studio held its breath as he looked down at Jimmy Kimmel with a mixture of disappointment and controlled fury. The action star towered over the talk show host, and in that moment, everyone could see clearly who the real man was and who was merely playing a role. You want to talk about my past? Mark's voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of that silent studio. Fine. Let's talk about it. Yes, I made mistakes when I was young. Serious mistakes that hurt people. And you know what I did about those mistakes, Jimmy? Kimmel couldn't speak. He just sat there frozen in his chair, completely paralyzed by what was happening. I owned them, Mark continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. I didn't hide behind comedy or pretend they were just jokes. I faced the people I hurt. I apologized. I worked to make things right. I spent years learning how to be a better person. The power in Mark's words was devastating. Every sentence hit like a hammer blow to Jimmy's crumbling facade. But what you just did, bringing up someone's past to hurt them on television, that's the kind of person you are right now. Today. Not 20 years ago. Not when you were a stupid kid. Right now. Jimmy tried to interrupt, his voice cracking. Mark, please. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. You're sorry? Mark's laugh was harsh and bitter, devoid of any humor. You're sorry because you got caught showing your true colors on live television. You're sorry because your little plan backfired, and now everyone can see what kind of person you really are. The audience was completely silent. Even the crew members had stopped what they were doing to watch this historic confrontation unfold. Everyone knew they were witnessing something that would never be forgotten. Do you know what the difference is between my past mistakes and what you just did? Mark asked, leaning forward slightly. When I hurt people, I was a confused kid from the streets who didn't know any better. You're a grown man with a platform that reaches millions of people, and you chose to use that platform to try to destroy someone. Jimmy looked like he was about to cry. His hands were shaking, his face was pale, sweat was pouring down his forehead. The confident talk show host had been completely dismantled, leaving only a frightened man who had finally faced the consequences of his cruelty. I didn't mean to destroy anyone, Jimmy whispered. Then what did you mean to do? Mark demanded. What was your plan here, Jimmy? Make me look bad so you could get a few laughs? Make yourself feel superior by tearing down someone who actually worked their way up from nothing? The host had no answer. He just sat there, completely defeated. You want to know what's really pathetic? Mark said, his voice filled with disgust. I came here tonight to promote a movie that employs hundreds of people. Good people who worked hard to create something entertaining. And you turned it into your personal therapy session, where you get to feel better about yourself by attacking me. Mark shook his head and began removing his microphone. The simple act carried enormous symbolic weight. He was done playing by the rules of a game that had been rigged against him. Those people deserve better, he said. The audience deserves better. And honestly, even you deserve better than what you just showed everyone tonight. Jimmy finally found his voice again, but it came out as a desperate plea. Mark, please don't leave. We can fix this. We can edit it out. Mark's eyes flashed with renewed anger. You want to cover this up? Pretend it never happened? That's your solution? We could start over. Jimmy grasped at straws. Do another interview. We could. There's not going to be another interview, Jimmy. Mark's voice was final, absolute. There's not going to be a do-over. This is who you are. This is who you chose to be tonight, in front of all these people. Mark finished removing his microphone and set it down on the coffee table between them with deliberate care. The small sound it made seemed to echo through the silent studio, like a gavel falling. You know what the saddest part about all this is? He said, looking directly at Jimmy with something that might have been pity. I actually used to respect you. I thought you were one of the good ones. I thought you understood what it meant to work hard and treat people with dignity. Tears were streaming down Jimmy's face now. Real tears, not the theatrical kind. The tears of someone watching everything they had built crumble before their eyes. But tonight you showed me that success doesn't change everyone for the better, Mark continued. Sometimes it just gives mean people a bigger platform to be cruel from. The silence in that studio was absolute. You could hear the air conditioning humming. You could hear the cameras quietly rolling. But not a single person made a sound. I'm going to leave now, Mark said, straightening his jacket with the same precision he brought to everything in his life. Not because I'm running away from this conversation, but because I have too much respect for myself to sit here and let you continue to disrespect me. He started walking toward the edge of the stage, then stopped and turned back for one final moment. And Jimmy, next time you want to attack someone's character, maybe make sure your own character can handle the scrutiny. Jimmy made one last desperate attempt. Mark, please. I'm begging you. Don't leave like this. Mark looked at him with an expression that contained multitudes, disappointment, disgust, and perhaps a trace of genuine sadness for what Jimmy had revealed himself to be. You should have thought about that before you decided to turn this into a hit piece. You made your choice. Now live with the consequences. And with that, Mark Wahlberg walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live stage. Behind him, he left a host whose carefully constructed image lay in ruins, destroyed not by some external force, but by his own arrogance and cruelty. The cameras kept rolling as Jimmy sat there alone, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding that some lines should never be crossed, and some people should never be underestimated. The audience sat in stunned silence, having witnessed not just a celebrity confrontation, but a masterclass in dignity, strength, and standing up for yourself when someone tries to tear you down. They had come expecting entertainment. What they got was truth. In those final moments, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, Jimmy Kimmel learned the hardest lesson of his career. He had spent years building a platform based on making others the butt of his jokes. He had grown comfortable in his power, convinced that his microphone and his audience made him untouchable. But Mark Wahlberg had shown everyone that some people are forged in fires that late-night comedy cannot extinguish. Some people have earned their place through sacrifice and growth that no amount of sarcasm can diminish. And some people, when pushed, will push back with a force that reveals the pusher for exactly who they are. What started as 34 seconds of smug superiority became a career-defining moment of humiliation. What was meant to be an easy target became an unstoppable force. What Jimmy Kimmel thought would be another forgettable interview became the night he showed the world his true face, and the world didn't like what it saw. Respect, as Mark Wahlberg demonstrated that night, is earned through action, through sacrifice, through the hard work of becoming better than you were. It cannot be demanded. It cannot be taken. And it certainly cannot be destroyed by someone who has never done the work themselves. The footage would be replayed millions of times. The moment would be analyzed and discussed for years. But the lesson was simple. Dignity cannot be stripped from someone who has truly earned it. And cruelty, no matter how cleverly disguised as comedy, will eventually expose itself for what it truly is. Mark Wahlberg walked out of that studio with his head held high, his integrity intact, his message delivered. Jimmy Kimmel sat alone in the wreckage of his own making, finally understanding what happens when you mistake your platform for power and your audience for protection. The lights continued to blaze. The cameras continued to roll. But something fundamental had changed in that studio, and everyone who witnessed it knew they had seen something they would never forget. They had seen what happens when authenticity meets performance, when earned respect meets borrowed authority, when a man who has fought for everything meets someone who has been handed a microphone and mistaken it for a weapon. The weapon had backfired. The ambush had failed. And in the end, the only person destroyed that night was the one who had set the trap in the first place.